All right, so William is in control of England, and he is building fortifications there and putting down periods of unrest as best that he can. And he's going to set up a system very similar to what was going on in France, in England, so feudal system. So the rebellious aristocrats of England are put down by 1071, and they get replaced by loyal Norman lords. And this is one area that I'm really curious to learn more about, something that I haven't done in the past, but I would like to understand that process if we have any records. And it's something I've always wondered about, like how do they go about doing that? What was their selection process, or was it a peaceable process, or did they, was it were they imprisoned? I'm not exactly sure how all that played out, but that's something I do hope to learn more about in the future. So they're going to establish, land holding patterns, military service patterns that are common in Normandy. He's going to have a council of landholders, sort of, the upper echelons of society, who are loyal to him, but also serve as, sort of a makeshift cabinet, maybe you might say, or his council that he works with on a regular basis. And this is going to be the group that is going to set up the landed aristocracy going forward. So a lot of the old line families that have titles in Britain are usually landholding families. You could imagine, having watched Downton, talking about the Crawley family, those families would often have at least some roots going back to this period. They've been in those kind of positions that long, and that's why they have those deep histories, and they're tied to the royal family of Britain through blood and marriage and other things. And so they're at a point now where all of that is getting started, and this council that he had of these landholders is sort of the very earliest version of Parliament that we have. Now, it's not Parliament by any means at this point, but you can trace some of the DNA of Parliament back to this early period here dealing with William. So in 1072, he goes on to invade Scotland and Wales. You have to remember, Scotland and Wales are both, separate places at this point. They're working to, secure all of the British Isles at this point. The last 15 years of William's life are mostly spent in Normandy. He was Norman after all, and so he would be, that would be home for him. And so he would go back there and then travel occasionally to England to, make sure that things were running right and secure his rule that way. And so at one point, he even had to come to England and arrest his brother Odo, which is a really odd name. I don't know of any other character in the history of Europe and that had that name, but his brother Odo was planning an invasion of Italy for some reason, and was possibly looking to establish himself as Pope, because the Pope was an extremely powerful character in European history at this point, and so he had to put a stop to that. And so William dies at age 60 in Normandy, and will be followed by his third son, who will become William II of England. And still today, he is considered, William the Conqueror is going to be considered one of the, the great figures of European history. Is always studied more and more, or over and over, by every successive generation. So it's a very important character to know about. So if you get a chance, you can look at this Norman Conquest video that will be in the list here along with these videos. And there's another video there on a brief history of the royal family. And we'll talk, obviously more coming up here, but this is a good intro to it. So if you want to look at this brief history of the royal family before we get further into the royal family, it'll kind of set you up. And it's mind-boggling, the complexity that goes through all of this. And this is just a simplified version of that family line. It can be much, much more complex if you play out as much as possible. So it's kind of a fun game to play. Like, can you keep up with all this? This is a CGP Grey video. It's it's a lot of fun to check out. And I did want to mention one of the things that you do get from this is that of bigger army diplomacy. And anytime if there's a conflict and you're trying to figure out who's going to be the next ruler, bigger army usually wins. That's just the way it plays out. Excuse me. I was losing my voice a little bit. But they are going to see, a slow development of government through all of this. So monarchy being the primary form, but over time, you'll see more and more of a build out of that bureaucracy that will become the British government that we know today. But it's a slow process, and it will be over time developed and developed and developed. So those are kind of two themes that you can pick up there. But you can check that out. That one's a lot of fun. Okay, so William is going to die, and there's going to be a number of rulers in his line, and a continuing sort of intertwining of the Norman world of France and the English world, and ultimately this will lead to what's called the 100 Years' War. And they call it this. Really, it's a series of struggles over time. Basically, the effect was that it cut England from France. That's going to be the effect of the 100 Years' War. It's a series of struggles, and ultimately England will be an island nation, still with the infusion of the Norman DNA in it, but separate from Norman or French world at that time. England over time will sort of lose some of its identity, but then will develop this new national consciousness, will become England as much more as we know it today. And as they develop, they're going to want to be their own people rather than being ruled by monarchs who may or may not want to live there and may or may not want to be really connected with their world. Maybe they would much prefer to live in Normandy, and that's not desirable for a lot of countries. And so I won't go deep into that. It is interesting process. There's a video here on the 100 Years' War if you want to dive into that. It's a little animated, quick video, but we'll give you a little bit of background on that. And so here, we'll move on to a little bit more recent events. So out of the 100 Years' War, you are going to get the Tudor family line. You have these messy conflicts, and then they have to figure out who's left, who can, out of the family line that had been continuing before, where should we go from here? And so the Tudor family line is going to come out of this particular conflict. It's going to be 118 years of the history of the UK will be Tudor. The most famous of, two most famous of this line. First, Henry VIII. So he is going to be best known, for two things. One, for killing wives, but first, he was known for separating England from Catholicism. So obviously, especially with the Norman invasion, you have a strong tradition of Catholicism in the country. And the problem for Henry VIII was he wanted to get a divorce, and the church was like, no, you're the monarch, and we prohibit that. And so he, asked the Pope for, special dispensation and wants, help. Primarily, the Pope said no. Henry VIII's wife was Catherine. His wife, Catherine, is the sister of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, and he's a very powerful ruler in Europe. And so, there's kind of two things going on there, one on the religious side and one on the political side. And so between all of that, the Pope just says no. And so Henry VIII is, pretty angry about this whole situation. He's the king. After all, he should be able to do what he wants. And so he breaks with the Catholic Church officially and creates the Church of England. So that's where you get sometimes it's in talking or writing on the PowerPoint, you might see a COE. I'll often abbreviate that, but it's Church of England. The Church of England had a good bit of effect in the setup of the United States. If you take one of the early America classes with me, we'll talk about that a good bit, because groups like the Puritans were reacting against the Church of England, trying to purify the church. And so that's where that line of religious devotion comes from, is the Church of England. This is where it gets its start, is Henry VIII breaking away from the Church of England. But he will also end up beheading a couple of wives too, I believe a couple of wives, because they could not produce a male heir, and that was his whole quest in all of this, was to have a male heir, and it never worked out for him. But that will be, basically his story. Just a poor showing for that particular monarch. The most, probably the most successful / famous of the Tudor line was Elizabeth I. She is best you could describe her as iconic. She really was truly an iconic ruler, very strong. So she is the namesake of an era. You often know that you're dealing with a famous monarch, at least looking backwards, if they have an era named after them. So Elizabethan, you may have heard that term, Elizabethan era. This is the era of Shakespeare, when that kind of language and the culture that it captured, that's this era, the era of Elizabeth I. So she was the ruler from 1533 through 1603. So very much a long, especially for that time period, a very long-lived ruler, and is strong throughout. She was very much in promoting the growth of the Church of England. She wants to grow England internationally. So at this point, Spain is a major rival for all of the European powers, but it was particularly powerful, obviously, in the 1400s, late 1400s. It got its start in its control in the New World, and so it has a significant 100-year plus jump on the rest of Europe, especially England, in trying to get a start in the New World. And so Elizabeth is going to push England in that direction. Not there yet. They're not quite to that point of getting a colony going. That's going to happen under James here, but she's going in that direction. She authorizes pirates to raid Spanish treasure ships and does all sorts of things to try to strengthen the England during this time. So the Tudors are going to end with Elizabeth. That's the end of the Tudor line. And the crown is going to pass now to the Stuart line, Stuart.